Before going into the course, let me give a brief introduction about the course itself. Starting from today till October 28th, we have about eight sessions um, in place. Each session will be around 2 hours, an hour of presentation and an hour of question and answers and discussions. So that's roughly how we have scheduled it. I've mailed you all a schedule of time and the date. So we have many of our sessions in the morning at 11 a.m. Except for October 26th, where we have Mr. Ravikant Joshi speaking to us. So currently he is abroad, so that's why we had to shift the timings to 5 p.m. On 26th, and then again on 28th we have one more lecture, one more session at 3 p.m. So basically, the course will start looking into from the beginning of planning and how urbanization has taken place, and the role of planning in the process, and who plans for whom. Today's session will be led by Aravind. Aravind Unni is a architect planner. I'll introduce Aravind later. Then from there we will look into the evolution of various urban programs, starting from JNNURM, BSUP, RAY, how it and the variety of urban reforms, reaching into smart cities. What exactly is a smart city, and unpacking what is smart city. The third session, we will look into critically into smart cities and governance, and how people's voices, people's institutions, particularly at the municipal level, at the level of the cities, and the right of participation, and how are they part of the decision making, etc. And we all know the smart cities promote a PPP version and an SPV. And so, how does this go along with the 74th Amendment and the rights of the people at the municipal level? The fourth session, we will be critically looking into how it is being financed, who are the institutions behind it, and what have they been saying about smart cities, and critically looking into the whole aspect of financing, and what are the who is pushing for smart cities in that level. Uh, Continuing with it, we will be looking a little more deeper into smart cities and municipal finances, and how they interact with the municipal finances. From there, we will also have a couple of people who would be discussing with us from the experience of their own city. So there'll be three people who would be speaking that day. One from Mumbai, and another from Bangalore, and another from Nagpur. So we have three cities, and those people will speak from a particular perspective. Um, uh, Trying to look into informality, trying to look into gender, and trying to look into caste and exclusion. So we'll be trying to see some of the city experiences into this discussion. Then we will be looking into how smart cities interact and disconnect with some other debates which are happening on cities, particularly in terms of flooding, in terms of transportation, the urban climate, the waste management systems. I mean, how do smart cities as a concept interact? How do smart cities as a concept interact um, with some of the urban climate, urban transportation debates? And lastly, we will look into the challenges in achieving just cities, and how can we build human rights cities. So this is the general framework in which the course is being organized. So we'll request all of you to be part of each and every session, rather than being part of one session, and or selectively picking and choosing sessions. So that will give a kind of a space in which we can see this workshop as an integrated whole. Um, there are a few of uh, the ground rules for this workshop. One, the participant audio will be unmuted during the presentation time. And after the presentation, you can write your questions in the chat and also raise your hands so that we can call out people, you know, to have for having discussions and raising your questions, opinions, etc. Otherwise, we request all of you, those who can, to switch on their video, whoever the internet permits and who are in a situation to open your video, so that we interact with live people. These sessions are being recorded. Some of you, and particularly some of them, had written and asked, asked us whether if they miss a particular session, will it be available for them, and whether recording is possible. Um, so we have decided to record each and every session and make it available to all the participants, so that you can go and watch them at a later point of time. Coming to the smart cities, it's a concept which was basically started and developed by IBM in 2008. Smart cities think about smart citizens, of which smartphones and whoever, and of course surveillance. So all the essential elements of a technocratic centered vision of city has been promoted uh, primarily by some of these big corporate companies, whether it is IBMs or Cisco's and Alphabets, who have been pushing for this huge market which opens before that. So there's an estimation by IBM that there is a market of more than 1.5 trillion out there with the smart city, the concept of smart city being implemented, and the primary beneficiaries being the technocratic companies. Uh, so, so so this concept of smart cities, which came different from some of the civil society demands on cities, which were calling for a human rights city, which were calling for an inclusive city, which were calling for a sustainable city. So all these kinds of concepts where people have been fighting in the cities to have a voice in governance, the voice in terms of in terms of building their own development plan. This concept of a smart city has come from a different perspective, as from a different angle, and we many of us know, and many of you are part uh, of certain urban resistance, urban movements, which have been trying to resist recreating cities in the models, whether it is Shanghai's or Singapore's, and trying to develop an indigenous model where people are at the center of urban transformation. Today, we will the first session we will start looking from the very basic of urban planning itself, and we are happy to have Aravind here. Aravind has a huge experience working in the cities with various social movements, the urban social movements within the cities. Aravind is a trained architect planner. He has also been part of various campaigns in citizens uh, demanding voice, participation in development of their own cities, whether it is in the development plan or in the campaigns to build inclusive cities. Currently, he's leading the work on urban poverty in the Indo-Global Social Service Society (IGSS), and have been a regular contributor to some of the issues on urbanization. One of his articles on smart cities, the curious case of smart cities, has also been included in the reading list, which we have shared with you. Um, Aravind will take the first session, and over to you, Aravind.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Majudada, for the lovely introduction. I will just add a correction. I am trained as an architect, but my work with all of us here has I'm using this, sometimes use this title of planner. So I'm just clarifying it here. A real pleasure to be here, I think, and happy to be a part of this wonderful discussion. And I see a lot of faces with whom I have worked personally over the last so many years, so many senior sathis and friends and experts as well. So really happy to be here and happy to be sharing the work that I have done with different organizations, with different people and community groups. I think one is that I would state that upfront. Secondly, I think what we also what I will also request alongside what Joe and Majudada said, that I think we can, if we can use the chat a little more, keep the chat active. And since all of you are here, and so we don't enter into a monologue, that would be very good. So I'll request everyone to use this chat to post questions, ask, comment, so on and so forth. That would be great. And yeah, I think that would be one good beginning to start with. So I think I'll just share my PowerPoint presentation. So I think today's discussion and what CFA was expecting from me was to kind of get a good understanding or share the understanding of what we could mean by what a urban is and what urban planning also means in India. So essentially, this is actually a prelude or a precursor to the smart cities program, which was officially kind of announced in 2015. And of course, there'll be in the coming days, we'll see a lot of debate and discussion on the specificities of what smart cities is, how does it operate, so on and so forth. So essentially, what the presentation here would be trying to focus is going to be mostly on what precedes the smart city and what was the growth and evolution of Indian cities over the last 100 years, so that we understand where is the genesis, so to say, of a smart cities program. So that is the intention of the presentation. It's a what do you say, it's more of an activist kind of a presentation, because that is the approach that I have with respect to cities and our work in cities. So I am going to present it from that perspective. uh, Majudada has already clearly said, I am representing Indo Global Social Service Society. I'm working on urban poverty issues there, primarily looking at cities and how to make it inclusive and just, a common objective of all of us, which is why we are here. So that is absolutely fine. Okay. So firstly, there are different sections to it. I mean, what is urban planning? What is the evolution? So first, just to begin off, what is urban planning? So if you break the word urban and planning, you get what is urban and what is planning. Urban is a very simple definition. It doesn't require, what do you say, a lot of explaining, so on and so forth, because the census defines it very clearly as a habitation. Uh, there are two ways you can know what is urban. One is a statutory town, where you have municipal corporations, you have municipalities, you have cantonment boards, or basically urban that have been recognized as urban areas. Then you have census towns that are that would be identified as census towns if you have a minimum population of 5,000. 75% or more of the male population is not engaged in agriculture, and there is a certain density. So essentially, urban is this specific definition, and by that specific definition, you at this stage in India, according to the 2011 census, that says that around 31% of the population is urban. We have around close to around 8,000 cities is what we are speaking about. But this number in the coming census, which is probably going to be next year, is definitely we are looking at a figure that's well above 10,000, and that's this kind of scale that we are looking at. And there are many researchers or analysis that say that if we alter these definitions little bit and make it more relaxed and make or have a policy where we identify more areas as urban, our urbanization picture would be drastically different, in the sense that we will not be a 30% urban country. We might be closer to a 50 or even a 60% urban uh, nation. So that is urban, but again with a catchphrase that once you tweak the definitions, the results might be completely different, and the power of defining something here is completely in the hand of the state. So whatever the state says, whatever the government says is urban, is urban. Planning, very ambiguous term. There is no definition to it, but essentially, like the way we all are, we something that we look for and imagine for in the future, and look at our existing resources and we plan for it. So that is a very ambiguous definition of what urban planning is. Further to complicate matters, what urban planning is gets little more muddled with these different terms that keep floating, that are different in terms of scale and in terms of the kind of planning. But essentially there are many terms, and probably all of this and a combination of all of this makes urban planning. We'll get into that of what exactly is that. What I can tell you in advance of what is not urban planning, because we now are in times and space where there is a huge tendency of going back and looking at our history and pulling out things and making more contemporary uh, for making it more contemporary for our use now. But there are settlements that have been there in the past, that have been there because of whatever reasons, might have had a planned structure to it. But essentially urban planning is then not all of this. It cannot be all of this. It has evolved in especially the last 100 years. So if you look at the human sort of habitation and of how urban or of how human settlements have grown in the last 2000 years, the first image, it is only in the last 100 years that because of technology, because of the building materials, the means of transportation, that you see that urbanism the way it exists right now, or modernity the way it exists right now because of industrialization, um, that is the area or the time frame that we are looking at. So we are not referring to Harappan or Mohenjo-daro civilization to kind of make inferences in the present. Actually, some of those settlements were probably better planned planned in quotes, but we are not going there. We are essentially looking at the last 100 years of growth. So what is then urban planning? I've tried to put together different words and make sense of it, because there is no official sort of definition to it. One is that it's in the modern era. It, like many other discipline, has evolved in the modern era, and is led by, or supposedly led by, a bunch of experts who are educated in urban planning, who are trained in urban planning or architecture. How this differs from other discipline is that it's closely connected to people's lives and people's existence in the cities, which differentiates it from other professions, that even if there is a practice, even if there is planning that is happening, it cannot be divorced of the people who live in those cities. How it again differentiates from probably other professions or fields or discipline is also that it's spatial in nature, and it has a very clear futuristic sort of outlook. It plans, or it imagines the future that we want in our cities. because it involves people, because it involves future, because it involves resources, land, space, it is essentially political. And a lot of politics decides of how urban planning happens. Because again, it has to be enforced, it also has a legal sort of dimension to it, a legal backing to it, which essentially is all of these things in any order, or in some order of a process which we'll be talking in the coming slides, makes up what urban planning is. A little more developed version of urban planning right now, because people find that urban does not, encompass a lot of other human settlements, or settlements that are next to urban areas, and so that it can be broadened to include the legislative and the financial mechanism aspects of it. A new, more contemporary term rather would be a comprehensive planning tool. And this involves three aspects. One is the spatial aspect of it. Second is the governance aspect of it. Third is the financing and the projects aspect of it. That is a more contemporary sort of definition of what urban is. But urban planning, like I said in the beginning, has evolved in the last 100 years, and it is a result of social reform, or a movement that was there, or that was very sort of visible or felt in the 19th century, and it has resulted in urban planning. So it's a result of a crisis, and it's result of social movements and reforms that we saw in late 1800s and early 1900s. That is the evolution, or the origin of urban planning. But what are planners doing right now, or how our cities are there as we see, and this is a much used image which we all know, is that at this stage the debate is very narrowed, very cynical, and not even addressing the real issues. The social movement approach to urban planning seems somehow diluted, and what we are trying to address are only symptoms of the actual cause, symptoms that have a deeper history, that also have a deeper meaning to it. And unless and until planners or planning as a profession or as a discipline goes on to address those issues, we might not uh, address the challenge that we face as cities. So from this, which basically says what is urban planning, what is the newer sort of definition of it, I move to understand the reasons of and the evolution of urban planning, especially in India, and what it means for us in the contemporary time. So I'll just run through the sort of, what do you say, a quick historical sort of recap of our collective history. So most of these things come from my experience in Bombay, and some of it comes from my experience in Delhi and a couple of other places where I've worked. And it would be essentially to understand the origins and understand, what is the baggage that we are carrying from there in the present right now. And I see a lot of my colleagues who have worked with me. So uh, this is a collective body of work, and you all have engaged in this. So please add, if at all required, right now in the chat, and then when we open up, we can take up those discussions. But I see a lot of colleagues. So the phase one of urban in India can easily be called or defined as a dependent or a parasitic sort of form of urbanism. Urban has not come naturally to our country. It is come the way it has come because we have a common history of 150 odd years of how colonial and imperial powers have ruled the country, and how they have established their roots in the country. So this map essentially shows of how British colonial powers started from the port cities and consolidated powers there, and those little lines that we see are the lines of railway lines, of communication lines, of transportation lines to the hinterland, to the hinterland, that actually secured the port cities that the British first built. So what we see is different forms of cities in India right now. So all of us, if we kind of just go back and think of which is the category that our city would fit in, it could be that there is a combination of these things, but usually what you see is that it has to be either old power imperial center that was eventually taken over by the British. If not, look at the big cities of Madras, or what used to be Madras, Bombay, Kolkata, which were port cities essentially, and they were the first ones to be established in somehow the 1700s. Then you have a very clear trend of, as you consolidate power, as you kind of move inwards, you have more cantonment towns, you have cantonments and military barracks next to your existing port towns. And then as you further consolidate and you see that British have established their complete hegemony in the subcontinent, you see that there are hill stations because they the officers required their transfer of power during the summers. And then you also have railway towns to kind of establish all that. So if you look at our contemporary history of cities, most likely our cities are going to be either of these or a mix or a combination of these. Again, there could be towns and cities where you have temples or other religious significance of how our urban has evolved around them. But essentially, this is how the power got consolidated and spread. How did that translate into our built space and environment? Uh, for people in Bombay or in other parts of the country would know what is this. Initial settlements were just forts, as you see in. So this is an image of 17th century and 18th century Bombay. The British had just come in. They had established ports that were essential for their business and transactional reasons to carry on their trade that they had established. Between the fort and the native town that they called, there was a huge esplanade. That is the practice, or that is the kind of method that they always had. And in those, this is another city and another example uh, of this is an example of what just a second. Yeah. So this is an example of Madras town, which again clearly says that you have a fort and you have a black town, you have a native town that the English and the well-off or the rich have huge issues with. And between that you have a Maidan. Between that you have a huge space, and alongside the two, you somewhere have a lot of barracks, you have a lot of cantonment that will ensure that you have military station there. There is always this question of when I was dealing with this for the first time, and when I saw or walked around Bombay and was interacting with people for the first time. So there is a very interesting question that we ask of, why do you think you have such a huge Maidan? Why do you think you have this huge space between these two settlements and communities? There are many explanations to it. There is this other explanation of, I mean, how the British or the colonial powers did not want to interact with the native population, but there was this other more sort of Marxian sort of view to this, was that the space, the Maidan actually was the distance, or was calculated on the basis of the the the, the distance required by the cannons to fire, so that in case of any resurrection or any revolt, the fort will be secure, and the colonial powers and their infrastructure would be secure. So that was a basis of initial colonial urban planning, to secure their fortress and to ensure that you have a segregated other in the form of a native city. What is very, very sort of eerie similarities to the existing area-based development plans. Some of these areas of the white town right now are selected as area-based development plans in smart cities, which is absurd, which tells that over 200-300 years, you have invested and invested almost at the same place. Then what you see is that once the colonial powers have established their power and complete sort of control over the place, this is mostly after the 1857 um, um, uh, first revolt or war of independence, as other people call it. It was very clear that to them that now we have gained control over the polity of the country. We have gained control over the polity of the region, rather. There was no concept of the country at that point of time. And now to kind of establish our what do you say, at that time also there was these huge developments that were outside of the country that have led to industrialization in England or in Europe or in the Western powers then. And that also prompted the colonial and imperial powers to look at India and the South Asian landmass as a possible space of pulling in more resources, uh, uh, pulling in more raw materials and manufacturing, and to supply to the world outside. This proved especially easy in the port cities, especially because you had established control, you were running the show there, and you could easily set up mills, factories in the outskirts. That is what essentially happened. That because there was a urgent need for the imperial powers to come up with industrialization because of war with America at that point. Their trade relations with France was quite low, and there was a huge contestation at the colonial imperial struggle of different nations. So which led to a quick urbanization, quick industrialization that we or that at then cities like Bombay were not prepared for, or the hinterlands were not prepared for. So what did that do was that there was a huge unregulated setting up of factories in the peripheries of all the cities. Now that that you can look at your own city as an example, the peripheral factories started to come up, and those factories were connected with the railway lines that we had discussed about. So that was kind of a forced sort of industrialization, and it only looked at setting up of industries for a commercial reason, for the exploitative reasons of the empire. Gradually, this changed, realizing that we have established control over the territory. We are here to rule. We are here to run. So the same maidans that were actually used for keeping that distance, keeping the native away from the white town, those same spaces became the administrative centers. The same spaces became the high courts. The same spaces became the municipal corporations, or the bureaucracy that ran the cities. That is a very interesting transition. And all those, like the Bombay High Court, the Writers Building, in Delhi, if you see the institutions that were set up, the colleges, hospitals, all those were set up between the gap of these two institutions. This also meant that there was a gradual urban reform in the form of recognizing that there is a need to address the issues of the urban. It also recognized that you need to have urban municipalities to deal with this issue, because now we are just not talking about pulling resources and supplying them and manufacturing them and taking them elsewhere, but you're actually talking about running cities. So it was around 1870s, 1880s that first discussions on urban reforms had begun. But even then, the approach was very clear. The approach was to secure our business interests first, to secure our transportation links first. The rest come later, but we are securing this. But we are investing a lot, clearly, as you can see, in the form of VT and other developments that happened, but not ready to invest in the native city, or not ready to invest in the black town, as they kind of called it. This took us to the next phase of what really colonial city planning uh, emerged from this chaos. Simple lines. These lines could be from anywhere, and essentially telling the horrible, squalid living conditions and the inhuman habitations in the city, outside of the administrative and the functioning, white, well-developed civil lines part of the city. Outside of this could have been any of the cities in India, in any of the cities in Europe, and this is actually a reading from the condition of working class in England in 1844. This was 20 years preceding what was to be seen in India, but essentially the conditions were very similar because of the neglect of the state, because of the neglect of the state in addressing the issues of the working class, the labor that were working in the factories, that were working in the transportation hubs. You saw that there were a lot of problems. Any sort of guesses of where is this? I'm sure people would guess, because this is, I mean, when I do this presentation with younger sort of cohort, and when we are having a much more interactive one. So this is Paris. Why Paris is famous is because of its lovely boulevards and the Eiffel Tower, of course, on and so forth. And a lot of our Bollywood kind of immortalizes Paris in our head. But what is to be seen here is that Paris was also facing a similar situation 10 years, 15 years before what Bombay saw, by the way. It was facing a situation so I remember we had mentioned social movements in the beginning, that there was a crisis. This was the crisis. The crisis was the inequitable sort of resource management, inequitable distribution of resources led to the native or the medieval part of urban centers in late 1800s out of control. They were out of control in many ways, in the sense that the state had no presence over there. The lack of services and lack of uh, uh, amenities required for the working class and the population was not there. Then you saw that you also had a very strong Marxist, communist ideas gaining ground amongst the working class and population groups, and there was a general rebellion sort of against the established monarchy. That prompted at that point, and a fledging sort of monarchy by Napoleon, to use urban planning as a tool to cut through these native spaces, not native there because they were the same place, but the more working class neighborhoods, and to ensure that there is now room, space to maneuver, to take your military, to take the officers, to have better control over population groups. That is how one whole stream of urban planning or urban control through planning emerged in the late 1800 1870s. And this is what we see as beautiful boulevards in the Paris now, which makes Paris what it is. But this was also a time where these investments ensured that there was this construction spree that was going on, and keeping a nation or a state that was otherwise bankrupt in on many counts. So this also kind of played a second fiddle to keeping the monarchy continuing. Similar to that, what you see, especially towards the late 1800s, is that the white city now has a lot of developments, has the transportation linkages. The what do you say, the British and the imperial powers have well established and entrenched their power in the cities, but the control of the native population is not there. And what you see is very visibly this whole, what do you say, uh, pushback from the population and people there. And that came off in the form of different confrontations, different communal conflicts, riots that happened for the first time. But essentially, what really triggered urban development or urban planning intervention in Bombay or in our cities at that time, this is just Bombay as an anecdote, as an example, but it is true of all other cities, was the fact that what we experienced plague in 1896, and what that did to, and that really prompted the the English to establish Bombay Improvement Trust, Calcutta Improvement Trust, Kanpur Improvement Trust, so on and so forth. Different big cities facing challenges of the same kind, where plague was causing a great havoc. Populations, huge amount of population were getting infected. They were dying. People were migrating out of cities, and you had set up a Bombay Improvement Trust and a couple of other improvement trusts to address that issue crucially, critically, and fast, because your other mechanisms of urban governance and reforms were not taken seriously and were not implemented till now that efficiently. Sounds eerily similar, very, very similar to a situation that we faced in the month of June and July. It remains to be seen what implications it will have in the urban. But around 120 years ago, this happened. This was the primary reason of urban planning interventions, the way we see in our cities. So these improvement trusts were primarily then looking at 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 addressing this issue fast. They had to do and take actions quickly. What they ended up doing was to demolish the existing little houses that the working class had. They used eminent domain of the state, and they went in, broke houses, and it was a knee jerk reaction to a much more fundamental problem of deep seated neglect and sort of bias against a certain section of the population or a certain section of the city, and it led to a knee jerk sort of reaction in the form of further sort of demolishing houses, demolishing existing housing stock. That is what BIT ended up doing. It also ended up making a lot of city streets very similar to what Haussmann did in Paris in 1870s, was to cut through and make these navigational sort of routes that kind of gave shape to the cities that we see right now. So this is very similar to Bombay. This is what has happened in Kolkata, where you have CIT, Kolkata Improvement Trust roads. This is what you have in Lucknow. Across cities, this happened at a grand scale wherever plague was raging, and it happened around over a period of 10 years. It also led to one more thing, was that it uh, ended up or wanted to make housing also as a measure to address the housing needs of the working class population. But what it did was, whatever little housing that it made in the form of BIT chawls or housing localities, it ended up addressing the issue of the well-off classes within those the habitations, who wish to kind of move out to these new localities, and retained and further deteriorated the situation of the native or the older part of town. So it made definitely, of course, new houses, but it actually demolished a lot more than the new houses that it made. This also was thrust in very strongly with a lot of resources and with a lot of power and urgency, which led to the existing little feeble municipal governments that were also having elected representatives at that point. They were also sidelined in the process. You could see that there was a whole sort of bureaucratization and what do you say, the administrative powers that were granted to officials and bureaucrats was very visible in this, and urban governance or municipal reform that existed in its little feeble forms were also further sidelined, looking at the crisis that we had. Gradually, in the last 10, in the next early years of 1900, was very visible that improvement trusts were not functioning. They were not functioning, and they were hampering or damaging the existing city's design. What it led to was a more sort of grounded approach to urban planning, and gave the first town planning acts that our country now has. And it originated in the time where you have it also required that not just the the urban core or the old part of the city required attention, but because the city was also expanding, because it was also growing now, you required new town planning schemes, you required new areas to be taken into the fold, and hence you had a town planning act. This was much more similar to the town planning acts that you have now, and is a predecessor to that. It gave the zoning, the building regulations, the public purposes, and everything. But it is just that by the time these acts kicked in the early 1920s, 1930s, India was in a state of turmoil. World Wars One and Two were quite close by. There was not much resource to put in, and there was a recession that we faced. So these were acts that were established. There were new town planning. What do you say? Departments that were set up, at least in the bigger cities, but they never were actually implemented, other than a few town planning schemes towards the peripheries of our cities, except for the fact of except for Delhi, where because of seat of power change, because we wanted a new development, and even here it was very evident that it was kept distinct from the older part of the town, and this was done around the early 1900s until early 1920s. Now, fast forwarding, because we have seen what the last 40-50 years of evolution of urban planning under the imperial rule was. That was primarily looking to consolidate their interests, their areas, or well developed. I would not say their areas, because by the time the imperial powers established control, the class difference or the difference was not just on the racial terms. It was actually more of a class difference between a white and a older or a native part of the town. So the attempt was to secure power, to secure transport connections, to secure factories, to ensure that the administration and the 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 city functioning properly function. But very less of attention was actually given to the working class and population group, which caused a lot of problem, especially towards the latter part of the century. This was a new epochal sort of event where we had attained our independence and we were a new nation, and we were now facing a completely different sort of a challenge. What you see here is just conveying the mood of what we felt at that point of time, was that we were a new nation. There was hope that we will succeed, we will do well. And in these times, when you see our Bollywood cinema, which is a very good way to kind of relate to of the dominant sort of perception at that point, was that you could be poor, you could be from some rural area who wants to move to urban centers like Bombay, Delhi. Then urban centers were primarily big cities. We were not talking about small cities. And it was city that was accepting of poverty. It was city that was accepting of urban poor at that time. Primarily, we were then addressing other big challenges that completely at least changed the landscape of northern Indian cities and western cities, especially, and a little bit towards the east, of course, towards the east, where a huge refugee crisis ensured that the first image is of South Delhi, Bhogal, Jangpura, this being Bhogal and Jangpura. And what you see in the next 10 years is a complete habitation that was, so all our resources and energy, at least in the 50s, was devoted towards this. It also meant that we were in need of new capitals, we were in need of new centers, we were in new need for industrial townships to further the interests of the nation, as we called it then, that then we need new temples of development coming from that point of view. But all of these were done by experts, planners, coming from the West then. So they were experts who were not even grounded enough to understand the realities, the challenges, the divides, and the precarity of the different population groups in the city. They made the plans well enough, nicely done and executed, good in scale, big in and grand in scale, but they failed to understand how they operated. But this also set forth a typical template of exclusionary master planning in India. This set a template where you just need to do a collection of existing data. If you look at the left-hand slide, do a collection of existing data, do land allocations, do your DCRs with a vision, and only have public consultations at the end of it. And that too, more of a legal obligatory manner, but not something that is really followed up. So this kind of set a template for future master development planning initiatives that were primarily exclusionary in nature, because they were drafted to a certain extent by dominant architects or thoughts coming from West, having very little or less knowledge or experience of the urban in India. This also meant that there were different layers that were also visible. That of course there would be master plans, there would be plans below that, zonal level plans, layout plans. This also meant that you have land use as a means to control development. You also have DCR and building bylaws to control regulations. So this kind of set the template that the next planning initiatives kind of followed. So if I may kind of summarize, especially the post-independence era, that we were really busy with a lot of pressing and urgent issues, but it kind of gave a framework of town and country planning organization. It gave a framework in the form of a DDA Act, which was cut, copied, pasted, like many CDPs and smart city plans are being cut, copy, pasted. But this was used as a template across different cities to make their master plans. Simultaneously, what you saw was you had the Slum Clearance and Improvement Act. Slum improvement was used very less. Slum clearance was the part of the act that was employed at a wider scale, not now, but probably later. Impact on the urban poor and marginal groups was very clear and visible, that mostly they were invisible. Mostly they were negated, that they don't exist. I mean, even if you are a Rajkumar in Sri 420 and you are accepted as poor, but at least in the plans, they were not visible enough. First set of master plans were prepared. Divisions and zoning and functions were very, very antithesis of what Indian cities were. They were very different, and they demarcated the CBDs, the residential areas, the work areas, the commercial areas, but were in a completely different reality of what we faced as cities at that point of time. Phase 4, the 1970s revealed a different crisis of of a nature that was more from a more, I would say, critical from a political perspective. These images again are very clear to us of what they convey, that there was a huge resentment against the state. There was unstable polity. The cities, especially the bigger cities, because they were facing a lot of migration, because they had faced a lot of refugee population being put in those cities. You saw that those cities were crumbling, and the different manifestations of that anger. Of course, you had the JP movement and the social movements and the student movements at that point, and the worker movements that gained strength at that point. And very visible way of that is the lead protagonist playing a coolie in a movie where the angry young man of Indian cinema was kind of defined. It also was very clear from the fact that most of the cities took you to Marine Drive or VT to show you the entry point of what Bombay was, and to show that people migrated, but they voluntarily probably did not migrate. They were forced to migrate. That was the time that we are dealing with. This period also saw evictions at a scale that was unprecedented. That also had to do with the politics of the emergency era, but that also led to a lot of community resistance, community networks that emerged for the first time, that engaged with the state. It also led to progressive jurisprudence that recognized right to life, right to livelihood, not right to housing, but at least recognize the right to right to life in our cities. So that is the kind of milieu that we were working in. This translated into different forms, and the summary of that would be this: that this setup, the crisis was very evident. It was realized that big cities of course need attention, but smaller cities also need to be given attention. You also had Indira Gandhi at the helm of affairs there, and was more socialist than ever, and came out with laws controlling land and different measures like that. It meant that it translated into key policies and schemes that address the issues of regional development, that address the issues of sites and services. Uh, Initially, there was a reaction against informal settlements, but they were accommodated, they were improved, there were resources that were put into it, which is why you see a lot of Indira Nagars all across our cities, a lot of developments in our cities in the 70s, at least the bigger cities. The bigger informal settlements have come up in the 70s and early 80s, and they have been migrations in the period of the crisis. But master planning and urban planning was mostly in limbo, because, I mean, the polity was such that they were not enough to able to kind of focus there. But the positive part or the aspect was that the courts and judicial interventions were much more supportive at that time. Liberalization gave us a different picture and an altered reality altogether. This transition from a coolie of the 1980s to a Dilwale Dulhania of showing you European pictures kind of narrated the aspiration or the global imagery and its impact that we were having in the minds and the socio-political system. This had many repercussions of how this affected and impacted our cities. I'll get to that. It resulted in a very interesting sort of scenario where a lot of these social movements that came up in the 70s and the 80s came together as housing rights campaign, as forces that engaged very strongly with the state and demanded more resources for the communities and the people. But it also led to a situation where you had a lot of policies being recognized, lot of policies like national housing and urban policy, national draft policy on slums that had come up. So a lot of policy framework coming in, especially also going to do a lot with community participation and engagement. But what you see is that the fundamental questions of the inequality in the cities, where our population, the majority populations were living, working, and were in habitats that were self-built, was not being addressed. By bringing in community participation clauses, by engaging the civil society movements in a lot of these discussions, it kept the question of fundamental issue of allocating more resources, more land, more development, different paradigms to address the issue of slums in abeyance. But what it did was came up with sort of different models that address that liberalization era very closely. So this kind of opened up the, the cities for participation from outside. So participation was one of the first areas through which investment was directed. Um, and this came in through the language also of the 74th constitutional amendment for the ULBs, which was accepted and recognized by people across. Urban land controls were repealed. FDI was allowed. Models and pilots were beginning to come up in, especially in bigger cities, especially in cities like Bombay, that were to be picked up at a later stage across other cities as well. Here you see that a lot of these new policies that have come up, that some of them actually sound really well, some of them translated into schemes, but it also kind of gave space to bring in under the guise of participation more reforms in the form of allowing PPP, in the form of allowing private investment in cities. And that was thought that that was the only solution to address the crisis in the cities. And that was the time where, very interestingly, National Commission on Urbanization came out with these terms like GEM and SPURS that you see as a precursor to a lot of the other policies and nice acronyms that we see right now. These policies also kind of were fundamentally based on the idea that NGOs and the more sort of collaborative civil society adopted the participatory model and were busy with other things and busy with service provision. It also was based on the fact that at least some models were based on the idea of the entrepreneurial ability of the urban poor that need to be taken to the mainstream and to be joined with the main financial system. But master planning was essentially viewed as a hindrance, as a thing that stops you from addressing the real issues in the present and now. So that was the kind of space that we were kind of dealing with. By the time we entered the 2000s, it had garnered a sort of different space, and it had acquired a different, what do you say, a color to it, where the entrepreneurial and the improvising urban poor that had to be supported, that had to be given state support, suddenly was criminalized and vilified through mainstream media, cinema, and the planning practices that we had at that point. It also gave rise to visions that were in a sense prototypes that were to be replicated in the form of JNURM schemes, in the form of now very similar to the smart city schemes. These global visions were actually just talking about the gap analysis of how much do we need, how many resources do we want to address the urban challenge in our city, so that Bombay can look like a Shanghai, so that Bombay can look like a Singapore, so that Mumbai can become a Western world that we see in our movies, in our cinema right now. This did not in any way address the challenges of urban poor, marginal groups, sections that required attention, but instead it criminalized and removed them from the vision. It also sought more participation, but more participation for whom? More participation for RWAs, for RWAs in Delhi and area locality managements in the other parts of the country. But it also meant that with the vocal middle class rising up, the new neo middle class that India saw during the 2000s, it meant that the rights discourse was gradually removed. Evictions, there are events where the vision documents have come in 2004, 2003. Based on these vision documents, you have evictions happening. So there was a huge correlation of how it did not stop at the criminalization and vilification, but it led to a cleansing of the urban poor from the centers. And you had a new sort of layering to the city, where outside of cities established in the 70s and 80s, you had these peripheral resettlement colonies that started emerging. Land was of essence. Land had to be cleared. No one really thought that that land could have other inhabitants, other uses that were probably monetarily not that sensible to the Vision Mumbai groups, but that had to be cleared and made way so that our cities could be what they are. It also saw that there was a gradual dilution of vote bank politics, or of politics of you know, the politics that the urban poor groups had to negotiate and ensure that their space was maintained in the city. That was getting gradually eroded in the 2000s, and that kind of these visions set the pattern for that. The state had clearly adopted a more facilitative nature. It had said that we now need to focus to make our cities global and not deal with these issues. We are more of facilitators, because only the market would be able to address this at a scale. And anyways, plans or administration or planning was viewed as more of a hindrance, as more of a deterrent than a quick execution. What it led to, this is much more of a recent picture, that it really played by aesthetics. It tendered to our needs of how we view our cities, and led to a lot of action in informal settlements. The way interventions happened in these informal settlements were fundamentally guided by aesthetics of who's looking. And if I don't feel that the roofs are looking good, I do them like this, so that when I land in Bombay uh, from any other town in the world, or any other town in the country, which is the financial capital. So when I land, I see a nice collage of colors, but I don't see blue tarpaulins. That was the fundamental thought that was behind this. This also meant that areas and sections within your cities became enclaves that had very fancy names, and names that could be from anywhere in the global north, and were primarily addressing to a certain category of people, excluding most of the other groups, and led to very specific urban sort of investments in your cities. This was also the time where models were being perfected. Models that were to be, sadly now as we see in smart cities and in other places, that models that were eventually replicated at scale, but the models that hid a lot of damages that it caused. So everyone knows of what Sabarmati Riverfront has done, but yet it was presented as a model, and now is being picked up across states and cities. What this did, especially in this era, was to kind of set clear that development will not cut through you now like the earlier days, because development could just go past you. It need not go through you anymore. We can take these bigger roads, bigger flyovers that go over you and connect the required parts of the country, or parts of the state or parts of the city, but we need not address the issues of the other people on the ground, the urban poor on the ground. We need not do that. We just bypass and frog leap into development. This also meant that the plans that were seen as hindrances were completely subverted by not by the urban poor, not by the working class, not by the working groups, but subverted by different groups. I had earlier seen Nitin Dada was here, so there is no one who can explain this better than Nitin Kubal of Bombay, because he lives there in Pratapnagar, and it is his learning that I'm sharing here. Is that the plan that was designated as a no development zone first gets converted into an amusement park that was allowed under the development plan. Then the amusement park is converted into Oberoi splendors. And this is just not one case. We know of how DCRs and urban planning was subverted in the case of mills, in the case of 44 such conversions that happened over a period of time. So urban planning was converted and subverted all across. And these are multiple examples that you would see that how these small notifications come and they change the legally mandated recognized plans in a matter of hours. This is the template that kind of set forth or a prelude to what we see as smart cities right now. That it gave rise to schemes like JNURM that focused primarily on big ticket infrastructural projects, that focused on 20-year visions surpassing your existing urban planning mandates. It was primarily focusing on creating one more layer of planning exercise where people, if at all they were engaging, if at all they were in any position to subvert the master plans, but now the master plans would not be relevant at all going forward, because it would be the CDPs that come with a lot of money and a bigger commitment and parastatals that are specifically wanting to address their implementation. They are being the focus. So master planning or urban planning, as we saw, began in the early 1900s, was completely going down and had been completely sidelined in our cities. Here, what you also again see from a civil society perspective, that the elite formations came up with NGOs, that the elite RWAs and housing societies came up with NGOs and actually bargained more with the state, bargained better with the state, and ensured that they engaged judicially as well to further sort of corner the urban poor groups and little navigation of urban planning that the urban poor has. Very quickly, to kind of summarize or to kind of take forward, and after this I will take 5 more minutes, Majudada, I think, if that's okay with you, to kind of take forward and summarize. So what you see is colonial hangover of master plans. Master plans, I think when we were working with the master plan of Delhi, we also had many discussions that it comes with this fact that it is a differential position of power that is being employed by the expert, by the so-called learned or so-called administrative bureaucrats, officials on the general populace that they thought were not able to kind of address to the planning needs of the city. So it comes with a lot of utopian and colonial hangover. And because we had earlier favored, the actions, or because we had not taken into fold the informality that was present in the early 1900s, late 1800s, where the origin of master plan lies, it still contains, it still vilifies, it still sees urban informality of housing, of livelihood, of different forms as something that need not be made formal, that need not be addressed by formal mechanisms. Market and political access is controlling all the planning decisions right now. So it is not based on what is required for the city. It is not based on what is mandated or required by the different population groups. It is just based on very similar to the fundamental origins of planning, of how do we secure more business, how do we secure more investment, how do we make more money. So it has become more of a market driven mechanism than ever before, and it is very tough to tackle this at this stage. Like I said, urban plans are not important. It is the schemes that are more important. It is the schemes and money laden new central schemes that are more important. But urban plans can be put in abeyance. A new game can come up, like Asian Games in Delhi, where the plan is suspended for 10 years, or Hyderabad games where again planning was suspended. So plans and planning could be suspended at will and could be delayed for whatever. Governance and financing model still continues, though we had departments specifically dealing with the issue of planning, because we had sanitation, health, origins of urban planning in India. There was also a very clear distinction of different departments handling different service provisions in planning, for instance, leading to around 15 to 20 agencies in one city providing for planning and addressing urban issues in that city, leading to a huge governance model where one doesn't know where does my land end, or where does my land begin, and there is a complete sort of lack of coordination from their end. Planning process is of course hidden from public domain. Inaccurate data and estimate projections, which are further sort of made problematic because it is not there in public domain. Inaccurate data or estimates could be challenged if it's there and it's debated and discussed, but because the templates were set in early 1960s, very less has been done to change those templates. There are interventions, I'll show some, but they've not essentially changed the templates of master plans that we got in 1960s. Universalist approach. There is no specific. It is assumed that if the city develops, or if the city or the master plan is implemented, it will benefit all. It does not look at population groups. It does not look at gender groups. It does not look at worker groups. It just plans for a general resident of the city. It does not address to the inequity existing and the inequity that existed in the past, and ends up perpetuating it. Informality I've discussed. Again, because informality is not taken into account, standardization of what is formal, not formal, what services go into the informal, all remain biased, and we play by the same standards and expect and we take streets through cutting through informal settlements, saying that fire tenders have to go through that. So we are playing by the same standards to informal population of people, where the level playing field is not even there. It is primarily expert-led discipline and planning practice. Last, quickly running through what we have managed to do of our attempts earlier in Bombay and now in Delhi, is that fundamental notion that planning can be demystified. Planning is not complicated. Planning is essentially a political act, and the divide that you saw between the black and the native town, or the manner in which planning addressed the issue of Paris, that was at the cusp of facing a revolt, is very similar to the planning that you see right now. Is very similar to the planning that is used to dominate and control populations that are used to decide where is the road going, where will it, what kind of hutment or settlement will it demolish, so on and so forth. So it was very critical to uncover the politics of planning and to just say that planning minus some little technicality is just understanding the basics of it, understanding the politics behind it. Because once you get that, engaging with planning is much more easier and possible. Attempt to take planning to people, it was very tough, marginal success, but nevertheless people could relate and understand and engage with these. At that point, I was in Yuva, and that was the organization that I'm working with, so all credits to Yuva for this, to even put your aspirations and requirements in a planning language and to share it with the different stakeholders was critical, and that the communities have been able to do according to their different um, ways and mechanisms. This was to begin to just show that Bombay or Mumbai has a map. It also has a map, and you have to identify your space and uh, uh, space and location in the city, in the planning of the city, keeping in mind the existing challenges that you have. Bring out the biases through research, through documents, play to the strengths that you have, which is working with the communities, having wonderful strong knowledge from the ground which the communities have, and that is the power that you have to exercise when you engage, or when you start engaging and working with the state, especially when you engage on planning or on issues that have got to do with visibilities of marking informal settlements that were not visible in master plans till then. This also meant that there is insurgency to the planning, not insurgency of the kind that, I mean, that you would see right now, but insurgency in which you pick the issues that you feel will ring the bell more with the state. So in Bombay, it was not slums or street vendors or other issues that ring the bell. It was actually the issues of Koliwada that struck the discourse with the state, and we could drive home the point of other groups because we started engaging on the issue that the state was willing to listen upon. So this was the phase where we stretched the realm of planning and addressed these different population groups that the communities that we were working with, and could connect to the spatial requirements of each of them, which was up till then not really explored by any sort of planning document to that extent. This led to alternatives that we had the chance to share, and some of which was adopted to a certain extent in the Bombay development plan, Mumbai development plan. It was definitely a movement in the right direction. So if you look at the case of homeless shelters, if you look at the case of gender being addressed in the city, if you look at the case of informal workers being given some space in the city, I think the development plan of Bombay could garner a lot of effort in that. Going forward, what we probably should do and could do is that wherever we have civil society networks, spaces, especially now in smaller cities, I mean, bigger cities, Bombay and Delhi, I mean, we have all worked and it's easier to engage there, of course. But looking at our urbanization, it is not going to be the big cities that are going to be the challenge. The challenge is going to be the smaller cities, the class one and the million cities that the next terrain of urbanization is going to be fought. So how do we take planning to there? I think that could be a huge challenge, because around 50% of the cities across the country right now even don't have master plans, statutory master plans as required by law. So planning then essentially is, of course, it's dominated, it's a discipline that's controlled and run by experts. But what as practitioners with some experience in the urban that we can do is to kind of shake up the status quo, to engage where we can, and at the right time and space. And I think take up the space of being a non-expert to address and engage more with communities, and hope that going forward there is a possibility to democratize planning, because it's only when this discipline, unlike other disciplines where you need an expert, like for instance in medicine you need an expert, I don't know, probably, but this is a discipline because of its close engagement with people, with communities, with politics of its time. It has to democratize to ensure that we are in the right step towards uh, towards inclusive cities of any sort. So that could be one of those key takeaways that we have. Or there is a high likelihood that the divides that we saw in the form of black and white towns, the divides that we see in the liberalization era that have cropped up, they remain, and they are only further reinforced by the schemes that come up and make them area-based development, so on and so forth, and perpetuate that uh, that inequality. So from that, I would kind of want to wrap this up and take this forward for a discussion. So handing over the mic to Manju. Thank
Uh, Thank you, Arvind. It was a wonderful presentation, leading us to the situation where we are right now when smart city is coming. Uh, what were the different kinds of steps we have gone through? What are the different kinds of phases we have gone through? What are the different resistance we have gone through? And also, what are the kind of experiences in dealing with some of these issues? So, smart cities doesn't come in a vacuum. They are coming in a period where there has been a lot of earlier experiences in terms of city planning, in terms of reforms, and as Arvind says, and those plannings and those reforms have a gap between the natives and the ruler and the ruled, or the natives and the white, or the rich and the poor. So the how do then when we talk of cities which are inclusive, which are friendly to people, for women, for children, spaces for workers and their rights, their services, etc. How do we take this all forward? And what is the new ways in which dominance control happen? With each layer of planning, we are seeing a new layer of control, a new layer of surveillance, a new layer of a kind of a dominance which happens, or dominance of the ruled over the others. So it was a wonderful presentation, in that sense. We have a couple of questions which have come in the chat. So what I'll request participants right now is that you could raise your hands. There's an icon which talks about raising hands, and then we can unmute your audios for a question or a comment. And before that, we can address some of these questions which have come in the chat, and you can continue to put your questions in the chat, or continue to share a view, etc., etc. And I think, as Aravind mentioned in the beginning, please make it lively in the chat, and also through your short interventions. So Arvind, to begin with, there have been a couple of questions which has come up. Uh, you know, Majori Fernandez asked, how was the figure of 5,000 chosen? That is for the urban definition of the urban. Was it arbitrary, and why is this limit kept unchanged over decades? Jagdisha asked, do we have a definition of cities in Germany? Mm, and Mrudula is asking about what are the critical implications of being defined as urban through the census. I think these three could be clubbed together. And
you. Okay, I will. though I'm not a expert on the issue of census and how it kind of operates, but my sort of reading of how we have dealt with census up till now is that to show that our urbanization is more controlled, calculated, measured, and we are not developing the way we are not. And also because we have a huge sort of rural baggage that we have come with, the focus or the thrust of all, at least the first 5, 6, 7, 8, not 8, probably 8 is too much. At least the first 5 or 6 5-year plans were very clearly on the thrust for addressing the rural distress, the challenges of the rural. That very little or less attention has been given to urban and its transformation, because um, the how was this figure chosen, or why has this not changed? Maybe one of the reasons could be that we do not want to deal with so much of urban in the first place, because if we were to change these figures and adopt a more flexible sort of a approach at recognizing what is urban, our urban population could be anything between a 50 to a 60%, is what I'm assuming. And that can also mean that it changes the way resources, financial allocation, a lot of the polity of our city or of our country would also change. Maybe those could be the ramifications, and the hesitance to deal with the identification of more towns and urbanization. Especially in 2001, that was a case where it was very evident that undercounting had happened, and many cities had left out, and which saw that there was a dip in the urbanization rates. But I think 2011 census to a certain extent captured the fact that smaller towns are growing faster, they are converting into urban areas. So that capturing was better, I think, in 2011. What remains to be done for 2021, I would say that I would not have much idea on that. Yeah. So that would be my comment. I don't know what is the definition of cities in Germany. Maybe we can check and kind of get to know that.
Uh, Marj- Marjorie Fernandez asked you to comment about when the numbers in the city cannot be controlled in a democracy, urban planning would require rural planning as well, so that the exodus of rural migrants were forced to leave because of the neglect in terms of ability of facilities, jobs, etc. Doesn't render urban planning meaningless. Will you agree to that? I mean, she's asking about your comment on.
Absolutely. I think the urban cannot be seen in distinction to the rural. It is deeply connected, and unless the rural issues are being addressed, the scenario in the urban would only kind of would go further out of hand. The number of cities cannot be, of course, it cannot be. Champion plan would require rural planning. But again, what we like, the whole image of rural migrant was probably true in the 70s. No, I think it was truer, I would say truer in the 70s, as opposed to now, where it is not really migration that is the primary driver for urbanization. Primary drive, I mean, it's the threat, I mean, which is, I mean, the threat that we always have is that, oh, now the rural migrant will invade, and our cities are going to be so on and so forth. That is not what the census figures reveal. Census clearly reveals that it is the natural growth of cities and conversion of and more identification of census towns that is actually adding to more urbanization. This whole myth of massive migration, hordes of migration, that is not there. Again, now the threat that we face is that how do we hold to our migrant population? So that we are constantly navigating this threat of how do we deal with people coming into our cities becoming bigger is part of the development uh, paradigm that we have at least opted right now. I mean, I'm differentiating myself from other civil society counterparts who say that no, we have possibility of a rural reverse migration, which was being said at the time of pandemic. But that is probably not the approach that I have, or I would have. I say urbanization is going to happen. The best that we can do is how do we ensure that there is a smooth, if at all that's possible, how do we ensure that resources are allocated justly, how do we ensure that we don't um, take ourselves into deeper trouble. Hyderabad being the latest example, Kerala where I am, are the examples that our challenge going to be very different in the coming years. Climate change, so on and so forth. So those are the things that probably we need to be more worried about. But of course, going without saying that rural intervention is required, but just that is not sufficient. Partly, hopefully, addresses your question or comment in certain way. Majority, I hope.
Uh, Arvind, Mridula request you to elaborate a little more on the work you've done with Kolivada to to highlight the issues of the urban poor in the Bombay experience.
Okay. So, Mridula, basically, what it was more of a tactical decision, and that is where the act. I mean, Majudada would obviously know, and our other friends who are working in Bombay would also know that it was much more easier for us to take our demands through to the state, make them listen to the state when we could say that in the master planning process you have not even shown Bhumi Putras of Bombay and their communities. So that was a way we could deal with Shiv Sena because their politics is based on the idea of nativism. It was a huge challenge to also ensure that Kohlis participate in same meetings as slum dwellers because the interests collide, the claims collide at multiple levels. But I think the best thing that we as civil societies can do is to ensure that at least some sort of exchange between these groups are essential to take our work forward. So that was the tactical sort of decision that we had to take at that point of time to pursue and push our demands through, basically, which is very also critical, which is what has also happened to a certain extent in RA, for instance. RA, I don't know if Nitin Bhau is still here. It was a huge debate even in the master plan process in 2013-14. It took a while. It took its own life to kind of for the Adivasi movement to come together with the environment movement to come together with the civil society urban elite movement that was not in opposition, but all of these things came together to did what they have managed to do. Wonderful thing that they have managed to do. So it took that time and space and effort. So probably that is something that you probably asked and I try to address. Aman,
Those of you are not from Bombay, Kolis are traditional fish workers of Maharashtra, Bombay. So the traditional fish workers of Bombay are called the Kolis. So this is for those who are not in Maharashtra, not familiar with the term Kolis. There are
Aman,
two more questions which are there in the chat box. I think you could club it together and respond. One is about bureaucratization of the planning. How did it happen in the second phase? And second is about whether technology can bring planning more inclusive.
uh, I was so yeah. I think by bureaucratization of planning, I meant that the the time and space or the crisis at hand for cities then facing plague, facing the epidemic, facing the crisis of having your worker population group move out was a huge one, and it required swift and fast action. It meant that the existing urban governance reforms by, I think, um, the representatives also were being nominated or elected from um, from the native population groups or from the local population groups. They were all sidelined because the pressures to act were fast, and they were handed over to British trained experts, bureaucrats who acted on the issues fast without even knowing the socio-cultural political context, which led to a lot of backfiring, which led to a lot of riots. This intervention actually is said to have contributed to the to the nationalist movement as well. It was the plague riots that gave a reason for Hindu, Muslims, and different population groups led by Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who was considered to the right of the political spectrum at that time, to pick up this issue of targeting the native communities the way the British did, and it kind of fanned different life altogether to the national movement. I think that was the point that I was trying to make. This has, to a certain extent, remained in our bigger cities. Commissioners are so powerful. I mean, go to any city. You have the commissioners who really take the decisions, but the other folks are just more or less to give recommendations and suggestions, and kiye karlo sir, and we will do that. But essentially it's still the commissioners who run the cities mostly, except for few examples of maybe Chennai, Kolkata, a couple of other places. But that is what I mean by planning being run by certain officials and officers. Technology can be a very good tool. What we feel, what we need to do, especially when we engage with the youth and how we work with them, is that, like, and I remember of how we used Google Earth maps for the first time with communities to help them understand and navigate their settlements and communities, and that was a very liberating experience, at least at that point. Now the work that we are doing, we wish to use the technology, um, uh, which makes it easier for people to understand maps, easier for them to read maps, because especially the youth and the young folks in communities and people that we are working with, or movements that we are working with, understanding, planning, or reading maps, I don't think is a problem, because everyone uses Google to navigate and get their things done. So technology can be a game changer, something that we wish to use in the near past, especially in the work that we are doing with Delhi, especially the work that we wish to train and have a new bunch of civil society organizations that wish to, or that are wanting to engage with urban planning processes of different kinds in their cities. If we can do that, I think that would be a point. But completely agree to Vijay that that is our core focus going ahead, or should be our core focus going ahead, not just mine.
uh, Professor Dinesh Abral um wants to make a small comment on migration, rapid urbanization, and urban livelihood question. Professor, do you like to have a short intervention?
Yeah, very short. Arvind, firstly, lovely, lovely, wonderful to hear you. Really, it was very cogent, very lucid, and I enjoyed listening to you. Um, uh, the issue that is bothering me is that when we are wanting to consider the question of how the future is going to pan out, how in terms of we have described different phases till now, but if we have to really imagine the conditions in the next phase, and that is our question of imagining, you know. But firstly, let's look at in terms of the conditions that are prevailing at the moment. uh, how can production and reproduction not be also brought into the discussion? Because when we are discussing urban planning, See, if you look at the towns or the Kaluk towns as they used to be called, they had a linkage with the rural economy, very clear rural economy. They had both secondary and tertiary production. They had even markets, mandis, and so on, etc. And then there were cities. And now when the new economy came in, that was different from the old rural town economy. As far as we call it in some of our production planning exercises, which we have done, and I don't want to elaborate too much, but a town and city can be distinguished, no doubt about it. The city was linked to the ports or linked to the other sets. So then in the post independent period, it got linked to some of the industrialization which we took up ourselves. So the point which I'm saying is one, that the production perspective needs to be integrated in case we want to, because the last 2000 phase has been no industrialization. Industrialization has been without jobs. It's been largely services. I don't know what the future is going to be, but it is also likely to be not very job intensive. It is going to generate informal employment as far as is concerned. Can we really predict in that manner? Can we envisage conditions which are going to emerge and then say, okay, now urban planning should have what meaning? That's all. At the moment, just one comment. Otherwise, there are a related comment. Urban ecologies have been not been integrated in our discussion till now. Urban ecologies is a very important point. We got urban leaves a lot of footprint in terms of energy, water, resources, and so on, etc. And it impacts on rural areas, impacts on lives of the people themselves living in urban area. I'll stop here, otherwise the story can go on. Yeah.
Uh,
Thank you,
Thanks,
Nilesh, for
Professor.
the. Majuda, please go ahead, sir.
No, I was thanking Professor Dinesh. Arvind, do you have a short response to him?
No, I know I'm in complete agreement to him. It's just that we have come to a stage where we we don't know what to do, and this is this is a moment of 1890s. We are reliving that moment in that sense. Um, so we don't know what is going to be the trajectory, the climate or the ecological challenge that cities need to address is of a different proportion altogether. So this is not just also going to be about I mean, where are the jobs going to be, where is the manufacturing going to be, uh, but I think it's a huge challenge that we have as civil society organizations, of how we engage with planning that is effectively almost dead in that sense. How do we put life to it? But maybe more people engaging with it, more people working on those issues could be the CPR that our cities require. Is the guess that I have.
Uh, I think we are reaching 1 o'clock. Um, and if there are no further questions which could be taken up, uh, we already had this discussion on the rural urban connect. Uh, Otherwise, we can bring the. There's a question which is coming from Joseph. Which would be the key point holding back urban planning in a decentralized mode? Maybe that's the last question we can take up in this session.
I Look, I think disciplines that do not want to open up and engage with people, make their language and practice simpler, uh, would be the biggest sort of hindrance of the. I mean, one of biggest hindrances of going against the decentralization mode. Um as long as decisions remain away from the public domain, led by just experts, and where you don't have mechanisms of community participation and engagement. I mean, smart cities and other policies and schemes do have these little spaces that they have set up on virtual media or Facebook or Twitter likes for community engagement and inputs. But unless those spaces are secured, there is no way that you can decentralize, because whatever be the expert, however well intentioned be the planner, uh, uh, just by virtue of the practice and by the distance that she or he would have from he or they would have from the ground, planning would never be decentralized or cannot be decentralized. That is a fundamental sort of uh, my reading of the discipline uh, of planning is my comment.
Yeah. Uh, thank you, Aravind. You've laid the foundation for the next section of the for the course, um, giving us a clear understanding about the historic development of planning and who has been the driving force. It was for whom and how control, dominance, all were exercised during these phases. Going ahead with this, tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we will have the next session, which is on smart cities and how it evolved, where we look into the various urban reforms which have come up in the recent past, leading to the smart cities. The discussion would be led by Gaurav Dwivedi of the Center for Financial Accountability. Tomorrow. So we'll meet at the same time. You could use the same link as of which was given today. We will be sharing the presentation, and Arvind has also agreed to send us a few readings, which will all be available in the drive which we have shared earlier. So as and when every session happens, we will have different readings and presentations added to the drive. And thank you once again, Arvind. It was wonderful hearing you after a long time, and very well you have laid the foundation and the direction for the entire course itself.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Very much,
Arvind.
sir.
Thanks a
Thank you.
lot. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you, Dineshji. My
Thanks.
special shout outs to my colleagues in Yuva. I mean, of course, Manjudada was my senior there. Nitin is here, and I saw Zubair, who's our very close friend. Mezabeen was also there. So special shout out to our friends in yeah. Hi guys. Yeah, good to see you here. Looking forward. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.